Welcome to Talking Postgres, where we discuss the human side of Postgres, databases, and open source. For regular listeners, I want to point out that the podcast has been renamed. It used to be called Path to CytosCon, and as of early July 2024, our new name is Talking Postgres. Thank you to the team at Microsoft for sponsoring this community conversation. I'm Claire Giordano, and today's topic is how I got started as a developer and in Postgres. And our guest is David Rowley. David is a Postgres committer and major contributor to the project. He works on the Postgres team at Microsoft. He spends the majority of his time in his job working on Postgres open source with a specialization in performance, specifically speeding things up in the query planner and the executor. I would say that David is also an expert in Postgres partitioning, and he's based in New Zealand. He's also an avid outdoorsman, so he does a lot of backpacking and camping and hiking and whitewater. I think it's whitewater rafting, but we'll find out, I suppose. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
I'm very excited that you said yes to the invitation. All right, so we're going to dive today back in time to learn more about how you got started as a developer and in Postgres. But even before you got started as a developer, I'm wondering if there were moments in your growing up years where you knew that you were going to do something having to do with math or science or computer science. Um, was there somebody who influenced you or something that happened that pushed you in this direction?
I don't think it was really a single point in time that happened. I think it was probably a lot of different things that just sort of pushed me in that direction. I remember probably like the first sort of introduction to computers was my first computer. It was an Acorn Electron, and this was a company that Acorn they really only existed in the UK. And I think they started out doing computers for schools mostly, and then they branched out into home computers. And anyway, but my dad came home with one of these at some point, and it came with this book. It was like a ring bound book. It's a user guide, Acorn Electron user guide, I think it was called, and it had like a series of example programs in that. And I just got started. I've been trying to find out what age I was when this all happened, and I don't know. I think it was like between 6 and 8, and I started typing in programs to see what they did, and I didn't really understand a great deal about what I was doing. I think, but I'd say that was my first introduction to programming.
It's interesting. It almost suggests that I suppose a lot of children are curious, but that the words you just used, that you started typing in programs to see what they did, it's you must have been curious.
Yeah, I definitely was. Um,
Okay. So maybe that's that seminal moment. Are there other moments that you remember where that interest in math or computers or even science was fueled?
I think I always wanted to build things. One of the things I did when I was a kid was I had Lego, and it was Techniques Lego, so it was kind of engineering focused. You had electric motors and rivets and differentials for cars and things like that. I spent quite a bit of time in my youth working on that, and I think I just like to build things.
Okay.
Um, I think, like as you mentioned earlier about my interest in performance work for Postgres, I I don't know. Like I used to in sort of my teenage years and 20s, I used to ride motorbikes a little bit, and performance of motorbikes was always an interesting topic. And I think I get a similar little buzz out of speeding something up in Postgres as I did maybe like tuning my motorbike or something when I was in my 20s. It's quite exciting to make something just go a bit faster.
I like it. We're definitely going to talk about that focus on performance, uh, because that is how you spend a lot of your time that you spend in the code on Postgres. So let's pivot to how you got started as a developer. Like, when did that happen? Was that during the motorbike phase or after the motorbike phase? Or um, when did you kind of do it as a hobby and when did you do it as your first job?
So my first job, um, it's a little bit of a strange story. I'd been traveling after I finished high school. I went through a slightly less trodden path. Maybe I ended up going traveling for a while, for a year in Australia, and when I came back, it was when I sort of realized that I had to, go and study and do something um, with my life. I didn't really have plans until that point. I'd spent so long sort of thinking about travel, and I I got a job in a factory where they process cheese, and I was just working in the I was working in the warehouse driving a forklift, and I'd I'd done some courses since I'd come back from traveling. Um, it was related to Visual Basic.net, so I had a bit of understanding about building user interfaces. And it was quite a new factory. It only been built in the last maybe year and a half when I started, and everything was quite modern in terms of like the factory machines, but their systems for recording information were non-existent, or there were pieces of paper, and I I was asked to build them a system to make this better. So I sort of migrated out of driving forklifts and into this role of writing this software, and that was my
How did
first
they
programming job.
how did they know to ask you rather
It
than
was
somebody else?
a couple of things happened when I was working in the store. I developed a couple of things just to make life a little bit easier, and I think that sort of triggered them to maybe look at the resume, the CV that I'd sent them, which had included the courses that I had done for that Visual Basic.net user interface stuff. So they must have. I think they probably took a risk doing that, and I I didn't know. They asked me if I would do it, and I took the weekend to think about it, and I thought, yeah, I've got to do this. I've got to give this a try. So I was 23 at the time, I think.
I mean, because a lot of people it sounds like you're not only writing and developing software, you're architecting it if you were starting from a blank sheet of paper, which it sounds like you were.
I absolutely was, and the spec they gave me to work on to develop this was store the data in a SQL database. Like that was it. So I had to fill in a lot of the blanks. Like nobody was an expert there. There was like a finance guy. This is a cheese factory in a small town in Scotland where I grew up, and so I had to research and fill in a lot of the blanks. I ended up using MySQL for storing data originally, and it was a few years after that that I migrated that application to Postgres for a number of reasons, and that was my introduction to Postgres.
Okay. So you're saying that you stayed in this factory developing software and evolving that software for several years then? Or did you leave and then were brought back to do this migration from MySQL to Postgres a few years later?
That software, I was developing it almost full time for 7 years. It ended up quite a big piece of software, and it started out in a sort of small area doing one thing, and they just progressively, well, I guess they saw it was working, and for what it was doing, it was making things better. So it sort of crept into more and more areas of the company, and it was I did have other responsibilities, but for the first maybe 4 years, it was a full time job, and then for maybe the last 3 years of that job, um, it was part time.
I had no idea that you got your start working as a developer and in databases in a cheese factory in Scotland. I love the visual.
That's actually working in Postgres. There was when I found the community, and when I submitted my first patch to Postgres, it
Oh,
was
you
when I
were
worked
still
for that job.
working for this company.
Yeah, it would have been 2008, and I must have looked. I must have needed an answer for something, and like I'm assuming I haven't checked this, but I must have either read something on the mailing list or sent an email to the mailing list, and that's when I discovered it. So I started following it, you know, loosely, not closely, and I think I must have looked at the to-do list at some point on the wiki page, and I picked something off there and thought I see if I can make that happen, and that was my first contribution to Postgres. It was accepted.
I wonder if somebody who's here on the live chat could dig up that first email that you sent to the mailing list. I think it would be fun to for you to glance at and kind of remember the specifics of it. Um, okay, so you're working in the cheese factory, this software that was originally created to make things easier, to move things off of paper and into a database, evolved more and more features, it sounds like, crept into other areas. Um, you're starting to interact with the Postgres community. Then what happened?
And I left that job and went traveling again. And I, what I'd mentioned earlier about going to travel in Australia, I was 20 at the time, and it was quite an eye-opening thing for me as a 20-year-old to go across the world by myself and travel around. It was by motorbike, and so after that, I went home, did that job for 7 years, and a friend announced that he wanted to go traveling, and I also wanted to go. So I left that job and I traveled for 2.5 years, and part of that time was in Australia, and then I ended up in New Zealand, and I liked it. So I managed to get a job and a visa to stay here, and that's where I've been since.
So for that 2.5 years, was that predominantly in Australia and New Zealand, or did you go to a ton of other countries as well?
I spent almost a year in Australia, then I went back home briefly for a few weeks and traveled around Europe. Went to like Norway and Iceland. This was on a motorbike as well. And I ended up going to New Zealand after that. So basically Europe, New Zealand, and Australia.
Okay. And when you first went to New Zealand, also on a motorbike? And did you
No,
did you go to both islands?
it wasn't on a motorbike this time.
Okay.
Um my girlfriend was with me, and we bought a car and traveled around. And at the end of that, um, we her visa was running out slightly before mine, and we talked about going home. She's from Scotland as well, and none of us wanted to, so That was when I looked for my first programming job that was with a company that develops software rather than a company that develops cheese.
Are you
Um,
going to tell us what kind of cheese? Is that relevant to the story? Do you know?
yeah, it's cheddar cheese,
Okay.
and in Scotland they have like normally cheddar's like a sort of creamy white colored cheese, but in Scotland they put some kind of red. Um, I don't know what they put in it, but they have red cheddar in Scotland, and so part of it was red cheddar and part of it was just normal sort of white colored cheddar. Um, so back to New Zealand, um, I got my first job in a like developing software with lots of other developers, and that was quite an eye opener for me. I always expected that like software houses would have like massively high standards for code. Keep in mind that I'd just been working on software by myself in this factory in Scotland. Um, so like moving to working with other developers, I I always assumed that the standards would be high and the code would be impeccable, and that's not what I found. I found that things they just you got them done, and when you finished them, you just things got swept under the carpet, and the technical debt built up. I didn't really like that. It didn't appeal to me. I was kind of used to having things to my standards, and I just I cast my mind back to sort of working or reading the emails on the mailing list for Postgres, and I knew that the standards there were really high, and so I spent a few evenings sort of starting to work on Postgres again when I first started doing that job, and that's where the sort of momentum built up, and I ended up sort of progressing into full-time work, and I left that job and I started working for Second Quadrant, and that was the start of my full-time Postgres work.
So, how long were you in this job, in the more traditional developer job before you went to Second Quadrant? Was that
So
like,
that was a year and a half I spent there,
okay.
and in that
And
time that was like I was going to be joining Second Quadrant before then, but there was like visa things, like my visa was tied into my job at the time,
okay,
so I had to become a resident of New Zealand before I could change jobs.
I understand. Um, okay, so how did you get connected to the team at Second Quadrant? Was that all through the contributions, the conversations on the Postgres mailing list?
Yeah, yeah, I mean it was. I guess you're working in the public, you're working in the Postgres community, so people that are working in Postgres see what you're doing, and I think it was Andres Freund that originally contacted me, and then Simon Riggs contacted me, and they wondered if I'd come and work for them, and I ended up doing that.
It's pretty wonderful for pretty much everyone that you work with now that you did that, that you said yes. Did you have, was it a no-brainer? Was it a decision that you made over, one dinner, or did you have to think about it?
No, I definitely didn't have to think about when I think back to when I first found the community when I was working in the job in Scotland. Reading those emails, I thought, oh, I just looked at the people that were working on Postgres. I thought, these are like amazing developers. These guys are really good. And later, when I was asked to go and work on that kind of stuff full time, I had to pinch myself. It was just an opportunity I couldn't turn down.
There's something about you too, though. Like you said that for the first couple of years, the software that you were building, the now it's a cheddar cheese factory, um, was using MySQL, not Postgres. So you probably weren't like exposed, I imagine, I'm just guessing here, to the Postgres mailing lists and the Postgres conversations in the very beginning. And yet somehow you developed high standards from the beginning. Like, but there was nobody working with you. How did you do that? Is there
So that
something
software,
earlier in your life where you had high standards?
I, I, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think I have high standards for everything. I, it just appeals to me in code, especially for a code base that's as old as the one for Postgres. Accumulating things like technical debt is, I don't see that as a good future-proof thing to do. But back to your comment about not having used Postgres much, that application that I developed, I only used MySQL for about 2 years, and
Okay.
then I migrated that application to use Postgres. So, and and that program's still live today and doing what it has been for the last 19 years now.
Um, how did you hand over the reins to somebody else when you left? Did you hand over the reins? Or did you wake up one morning and say, I'm out of here, I need to go travel? Or was there like a, I don't know,
Um,
was it well
yeah,
documented?
that's a good question. When I announced I was leaving, I had to write documentation for 2 months, and I I still do a bit of work for them. To it seems really I never really to do much like that. Software just seems to work. But they can still call me, and I have several days to respond to them, and there hasn't really been too many urgent things.
Quite a nice testament. Okay, so of those 7 years, 5 of them were spent with Postgres, and you're saying that that exposure to the Postgres community influenced your standards, if you will, your expectations for avoiding technical debt or um, what the quality of a source base should be like. Is that, did I get that right?
I I'm not sure. Like I don't know if influenced or already had those. It's a good question. It's certainly like working on Postgres appealed to me because of that. So I just don't know what came first. If I developed sort of, let's call them high standards, but it's all relative. As a result of working on Postgres, or if those existed before, I don't know. It it's something that certainly helps to get stuff accepted into Postgres.
Yes, I can imagine it's very helpful. Whether it's a nature or a nurture thing, we'll probably never know, is what you're saying. Um,
Yeah.
okay. So in the chat on Discord, it looks like Rob Treat dug up what might be your first email sent to the mailing list, and it's timestamp 2008. So March of 2008, and the subject line is possible problem with extract, epic from timestamp. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you or brings back any memories, but you should take a peek at it later.
Oh wow, yeah. I I presume that was my first email. I think that's another subject that's been revisited recently with what extract returns. I don't recall the details of that. I think my first patch was around faster lookups for text searching for the position function in Postgres. And there was an item on the to-do list around using Boyer-Moore horse-spool. Sorry, it was actually using Boyer-Moore algorithm to speed up text position searching. And yeah, that my patch used a sort of most of that algorithm, a slight variant of that algorithm to speed that up. And that was my first accepted patch.
And I think it's really interesting that your first accepted patch was had to do with speed, had to do with performance, had to do with faster lookups, right? Which is kind of what I know you for, right? The blog post that we've collaborated on together, you wrote a blog post about speeding up sort performance in Postgres 15. Oh, and when I say collaborated, you're the primary author, right? I just had the privilege of being the reviewer, and helping optimize a few things. But sort performance, number one. And then the next blog post was what's new in the Postgres 16 query planner. And you covered, it looks like 10 different items of things that were new in that release, but many of them were performance related as well. So I'm
Yeah,
just
it's
wondering, how can we talk about that? What is it about you and performance? Did it come from the motorbike experience, or was it there even before then?
um I think it's because I'm Scottish and I'm cheap. So I want to be cheap with my CPU cycles as well as my money. I don't know. Um it, yeah, it's a good question. I think I just got a buzz of making things go faster. Um it feels like working in a race car. You know, if you were in a Formula One team working in a race car, you'd be all about trying to squeeze a few percent here and there out of, for performance. And for me, it feels I've never done that, but it feels exciting, like that should be. And I think that's why I've stayed interested in doing that kind of work for such a long time.
Um, One of the questions that Daniel Gustafson wanted me to be sure to ask you about is when you first started working on Postgres, and he wondered why. Why did you pick the query planner? Why did you pick one of the most complicated parts of Postgres um, to focus on? And I'm actually not sure if that focus came in your first year or not for a couple years. So maybe you have to walk me through that. But we need to talk about why the planner, why the optimizer.
Yeah, that is a good question. It's probably an area that doesn't get a lot of love. Um, I think it probably came from the first job I had in New Zealand. We were using SQL Server, and I'd had the Postgres experience, and at the time I was sort of starting to do a bit of Postgres stuff in the evenings. I find that I was constantly sort of comparing SQL Server to Postgres in
Okay.
regards to the query planning, and I would see that SQL Server might do something that Postgres didn't. And I think I just felt some loyalty to Postgres, and it made me a little bit sad that Postgres didn't do a particular optimization that SQL Server did do. And that's when I sort of started trying to fix those things. And I think the job in Scotland, I was doing a lot of writing SQL, writing queries, writing reports for different things. And I think I probably got pretty good at writing SQL, and I wasn't really touching the internals of Postgres at all. It's all, from the user perspective. And you'd get slow queries now and again in reports, and you'd have to do something, maybe, and that might involve rewriting the query. So I think I probably learned quite a lot about when you rewrite a query, you might form the query in another way that's equivalent to give the same results, but force the optimizer to produce a plan that executes the query in a slightly different way that's more optimal. And I think when you do that sort of stuff quite often, I think you learn quite a lot about what's equivalent to what. And I think I just had an idea of what could be done in the query planner to produce a plan that executes things in a more optimal way.
I think it's fascinating. Um, there's a question that came in on the chat from Rob Treat about how you learn the computing internals to be able to do like optimizations on the planner and the optimizer for Postgres. And I feel like you just answered part of that question, or maybe there's more things. But it sounds like you're saying that your experience as a user, your experience as someone who had to rewrite queries or had to get really good at um, formulating equivalent queries, that influenced your understanding of Postgres.
I guess there's probably two parts to that. There's work that I've done in the query planner to maybe have it execute the query or have it consider a plan to execute the query in a different way. And then there's also work on actually make existing code faster. And I guess the end result of those is potentially the same thing. Postgres goes faster, but how you get there is kind of different. Like, for example, a performance improvement that speeds something up during execution, then that might be like doing something like using a different algorithm for something related to execution. And maybe that's what Robert's talking about. One of the things I did when I think I was 21 when I got home
When you got home to Scotland.
to Scotland, yeah.
Okay. Because home is New
And
Zealand now, is that right?
I'd say yes, home is New Zealand now. That's where I live. It's kind of confusing. Often home is interchangeable between the two places.
Yeah.
Um,
I,
so
I
home
hear you.
Scotland. It,
Okay. Home
it was home
Scotland.
at the time. Yeah. And this was like the year 2001. So it was the sort of start of the mass use of the internet. And my mum and brother, they had bought themselves a computer to keep in contact with me through email when I was away. It's before the days of instant messages and things like that. Before the days of smartphones. And when I arrived back home, this computer was there, and I, I wanted to learn, so I ended up. Also, like when I got home, it felt quite. I'd been sort of my horizons were broadened to I'd been to places and seen a few things, and I moved back to the small village I grew up in Scotland. So I just started seeking. I wanted to talk to people that were in different parts of the world, and I found IRC, and I sort of got back into. This is before the job in the cheese factory. I think that's when I refound programming, and I had a friend there, and he had his own IRC network, and I got really interested, and I wrote like a channel service bot for IRC, and I picked C to do that. Actually, my initial choice was C++, but for some reason, quite early on, oh, I couldn't figure out how to link two C++ files together once they're compiled, and for some reason, I decided to use the opportunity to switch to C. And I worked on that I was working at the time, so in my spare time, I was working on that, and I spent about a year working on this project, and that's what really got me into sort of you know algorithms like data structures and things in C. I learned a huge amount there, like things like hash tables and binary search trees, because you were looking at potentially a lot of data processing, a lot of lookups that needed to be fast. The IRC network wasn't that big, but I just wanted to make this fast, and it was exciting because I was learning a lot of sort of low level things and concepts that have sort of come back in Postgres. Like a few years ago, John Naylor worked on a project, and Tom Lane as well. I think they worked on using a thing called a perfect hash function to have faster keyword lookups in Postgres for parsing um, SQL text. And they used something called a perfect hash function to do that. And it just means you don't have any collisions in your hash table. But that was something I'd done in this IRC bot years before. So it was I think I got into quite a lot of stuff there, and I learned a huge amount about data structures and computer science topics.
But this was all self-taught on that computer that your mom got to stay in touch with you while you were traveling. Is that right?
Yeah, self-taught. A lot of research, a lot of finding articles about different data structures. But yeah, self-taught, and it was that that's kind of what led me to go into do that course that I mentioned about VisualBasic.net. Um, I just really enjoyed the sort of low level stuff, the back end stuff, the performance stuff.
Um, the the research that you were doing, you're talking about 2001. Like, were research skills just natural to you? Because I can't imagine that search was nearly as good back then as it is now. Or did you run into a ton of obstacles trying to get answers to the questions that you had? Or did it just all like work? Were you able to find the answers to your questions?
Yeah, that is a good question.
You may
I
not remember.
I yeah, I can't remember. Um, I don't know if I had other software as an example. Like there was certainly I would have been sort of referencing like the IRC daemon software. Um, and I would have probably been looking at how that did stuff potentially. And maybe that was a guide for learning. I don't know. I certainly like distinctly remember looking up a certain type of balanced binary search tree, and that wasn't in that IRC network software. So like I was finding articles on the internet, about data structures, and there was search engines back then. I guess there just wasn't as many articles to find.
Yeah, and maybe search was better in 2001 than I'm giving it credit for. I suppose it wasn't that long ago. Um,
Yeah, it's really hard to
okay.
remember.
Okay. So, I have so many questions that we haven't even gotten close to yet because we're still back on early days for you. Um, Once you went to second quadrant and you started working on Postgres, were you working on Postgres full time when you hired on there?
Yeah, so with Second Quadrant, it was a mix of doing support for the customers they had and also working in Postgres. I think the time split there was meant to be roughly 50-50 between those two. And I've got no idea if that's what it was.
Okay.
I think that my time zone and um, forgot to say earlier, thank you for moving this so I didn't have to wake up at 4 o'clock this morning. Um, but my time zone in New Zealand, it's UTC plus 12 or 13 depending on the time of year. It was actually really good for like to save giving people in Europe the night shift. You could give David the day shift. So I probably ended up doing my fair share of support shifts for them, and the rest of the time once I finished the shift, I'd be, working on some patch that I was trying to get into Postgres.
Was that support work important, or did it influence your mindset that you bring to your engineering work? Like, did it give you empathy or understanding? Because obviously you yourself had been a user, so you already had some user perspective. But I'm just curious if support work made you a better engineer.
Yeah, I think it really does because you see a lot of repeated problems like this, people experiencing the same problem over and over, and it's kind of just like it's hard not to want to fix those things because like my motivation was to work on Postgres, and if I had to deal with a customer's problem that was the same problem as I'd seen the week before, for example, then it motivates you to want to try and fix that to reduce the time you spend trying to fix the same problem over and over. So you do learn a lot about actual real world problems that users have, and it definitely influences you to. So you end up fixing actual problems that people have rather than problems that you imagine that people have. And you can also get that from following along in the general Postgres mailing list. You get people there reporting what issues they're having, and it's always good to keep your finger on the pulse in there. I think to see what people experience as users of Postgres, and keeps us in check for things we want to fix or improve.
The place I'm taking notes, because I had, given myself a bunch of questions I wanted to ask you. Where I'm writing notes right now is right next to a question that says, "How did you get good at Postgres? How did you build the skills that you needed to be the Postgres contributor that you are now?" And it's interesting because maybe this support work and keeping your finger on the pulse, the bugs mailing list, for example, maybe those things are part of the answer. Like maybe they helped you get good.
Yeah, well, thank you for the saying I have the skills. um,
Oh,
I
I'm not the only one who says that. So that is a statement of fact, not a nice compliment. But okay, how did you get good at Postgres? Maybe support is part of the answer. Maybe it's not. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. So maybe enumerate all the ways, all the things you did. And this is relevant not just because people want to know your background and they're curious, but also because some of the people who listen to this podcast are trying to figure out, do I want to become a Postgres contributor? And so they, if you've got a cookbook or a list of things that will help somebody get good at it, that's good to share.
so I think how I got good at Postgres. Well, I think that that project I had in C when in 2001, 2002, like I think that gave me a lot of C skills, data structure skills, and you know how to write C code in general. That doesn't help me know anything about Postgres for sure. I when I was traveling after I left the cheese factory job in Scotland, I spent I had a laptop with me, and I did spend quite a lot of time reading the Postgres mailing lists while I was traveling, in the evenings. And I think like I also remember reading the entire manual, I think, for Postgres 9.1 during that time. I was traveling by myself in Australia, and quite often I was maybe in a very remote part of the desert in Australia. And in the evenings, quite often there wasn't a great deal of things to do. So I ended up just doing a lot of reading, and one of the things that I did read was the manual for Postgres 9.1. And between that and the mailing list, I think you pick up a lot about how Postgres works. I think I wasn't really looking at the actual source code much at that point. I think that only came from when I moved to New Zealand and was doing a bit of Postgres in the evenings, I'd started looking at the actual C code of Postgres. So I think there's a combination of a lot of things. Like I got a lot of exposure to Postgres as a user when developing that application for the cheese factory in Scotland. Plus the C background for that IRC and channel service bot project. And then reading the manual and reading the mailing lists, and then finally sort of diving into the code base and seeing the inner workings for myself. And also, like, the mailing list, it's full of really smart people, and they have a lot of really smart things to say. So, like, just that's just such a large contributing factor, to learning all this stuff, I think.
I think that's true for you and true for a lot of people. Like when you get exposed to um, discipline, rigor, uh, communications that are very logical or analytical or well structured. But I don't think everybody assimilates those kind of patterns. I don't know. I I think you have to have that curiosity or be paying attention, be attentive to the fact that the way in which people are communicating or the topics they're explaining well. I don't know. Maybe you disagree. Maybe everybody absorbs. Um, what is it they say? They say that um, that you should pick your friends carefully to be like good influences on you and to be kind of the kind of person that you want to be, right? Because your friends can bring you up or bring you down. So maybe what you're saying is that the folks on the mailing list set a good example and brought you into that world.
I think, like, reading those emails and just when you read those, in the PGSQL hackers mailing list, you you can tell the project has high standards. When you see a patch being reviewed and just how much detail like a reviewer would go into to checking that patch and seeing that it is correct and does what it is meant to do. That it's hard not to sort of be influenced by that and just develop a high standard. And if you want to succeed in Postgres, then I think you really need to adopt that mindset, because when I think back to my first job in New Zealand, when I didn't work on Postgres, the standards there were just different. There was a peer review system, but it just didn't seem that thorough, and things were committed that probably were, late, and they just got pushed in at the last minute to get them in because somebody was waiting for them and there was a customer paying that company money. And that doesn't exist in Postgres. I mean, of course, there's companies that are making money from Postgres, but because the people that are actually working in Postgres are from lots of different companies, if somebody that's reviewing some work that I've done works for a different company, then they don't know or care that the company I work for has a customer waiting for this feature. So we're sort of less motivated by customer needs. Like we don't rush things in Postgres to satisfy a customer that somebody, an employer has. And
Yeah.
that keeps I think that keeps the code cleaner, like not rushing things in at the last minute.
Okay, so circling back to how you got good at Postgres, and again with an eye toward if somebody were looking to become a Postgres contributor, how might they do it? I guess I should qualify this topic with a belief that I have, which is that there's no one path into Postgres. Like we're here today to talk about your experience and your journey, but there are other journeys and there are other paths. So please, whoever's listening, don't think that David's answer is the only answer. Um, but David's answer is useful. And so you talked about your how you learned to program in C, you talked about reading the mailing list, you talked about reading the manual, you talked about your experience as a Postgres user back in the cheese factory in Scotland. And particularly, you were rewriting SQL queries to try to deal with slow query problems. Um, are there any books or tutorials or blogs, or like was there a Bible that you also read that you would recommend to people who want to become Postgres developers?
One book that I did find very good. It wasn't specific to Postgres. It's called The Art of SQL or The Art of SQL, and I've forgotten the name of the author. Um, it's a French guy. Um, I thought it was a very well written book. The chapters were broken down. There's an old book, The Art of War, and I think it breaks the chapters down to various techniques. And done a he'd done this book in a similar sort of way, like fighting on multiple fronts was talking about concurrency and ways to deal with that better, and the things you can do to write your queries in a better way. And I think that book it really just changed my perspective on how to use a database. It was just, for example, like one example that I do remember was like checking user credentials during a login. I had written that application. You'd do a select query to query the table that stores that information, and to validate the username and password are correct. But that guy's approach to that was do an update statement. So one of the things, the application that I'd programmed during my time in the cheese factory, there would be a column to mark the last login time for a user. So instead of doing a select query, this guy said, do an update query and put the details in the where clause of the update and check if you got 1 or 0 rows returned. And if you got 0 rows, then people don't need to know the reason why they couldn't log in. You don't want to say it's the incorrect password, because that might give something away that they found a correct username, for somebody malicious trying to brute force something. So it changes. Instead of got 2 operations doing a select then an update, you just do an update. And there's just small tips like that I found really interesting, and it was a perspective that I hadn't really thought about before.
So,
Uh,
while you were talking about this on the live chat that happens in parallel, people were discussing two different books. There's The Art of Postgres written by Dimitri Fontaine, who is French, but there's also The Art of SQL that's written by Stéphane Farou,
yes,
who
that
is
one.
also French. And what I'll say when I look at The Art of SQL, it does say that his book, named after The Art of War by Sun Tzu, contends that. So it does seem to have that connection to the Art of War. So is that the one you meant?
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So not Postgres specific, but really helped you. And when did you read this? Where were you in your journey?
Um, in the cheese factory in Scotland.
Okay.
It's mostly from a user perspective of Postgres. Like that's not going to be a useful book to read if you want to get into the internals of Postgres. It's really about SQL.
Yeah. I mean, which is the way in which users interact with and take advantage of Postgres. So it's important, obviously. Okay. Any other books or blogs or tutorials or things that you have that were useful to you in your journey, or that you find yourself recommending all the time?
Well, I think more recently, I've been getting into sort of low-level CPU stuff, trying to educate myself a little bit more around how to write more efficient code so it runs faster on a CPU. And there's a book by um, Theodore Picus, and the title, I can't remember the title at the moment. Somebody might be able to look that up. Fedor Picus. And I find that book's very good. He does a lot of low-level benchmarking and, you know, CPU profiling and he talks about branchless programming, and he demonstrates why certain code is faster. And I've read maybe half of that book at the moment and sort of slowly progressing my way through it. I highly recommend that book. It's very good.
Okay. I haven't found it yet, but I'm waiting for somebody to pop it up. Is it The Art of Writing Efficient Programs?
Yes, that is the one.
Okay. All right, good. We have a recommendation. But, you haven't gotten to the ending yet. So you don't know if the conclusion, is gonna make you happy or not. I'm teasing. That's really a problem more with fiction than it is with nonfiction, right? Where you like everything in the book, you like all the character development, you like the plot until you get to the ending, and you hate the ending.
Yeah, I'm holding out for that twist at the end.
Okay, so it's I was hearing you say Theodore, but it's Fedor. Fedor is his first name, and the last
I
name
I
Picus is
probably
Pikus.
I probably butchered the pronunciation.
Or I didn't hear you properly. That could be it too. Um, okay, awesome. 2 book recommendations. I appreciate it. Anything else that you uh found really, really useful to your kind of developer learning journey?
Probably mostly blogs. Apart from that, there's a lot of sort of low-level CPU blogs that I'm quite interested in. Um, give me one sec to like this Tony Finch. He's got a blog and the website's dot at. Dot is spelled out DOTAT.AT. And he talks about quite a lot of low-level stuff like SIMD related stuff. For example, he's got some stuff on there about using SIMD within a register, which is something I didn't know until a few years ago. And I recently committed something SIMD related to Postgres. In fact, it was just yesterday. And I think, keeping up with what he has to write I find it very interesting.
There's a quote in the chat that I really like that I think is from Simon Willison, who was actually a guest on the very first episode of this podcast, back when it used to be called Path to CitusCon. And the quote is, "In this highly distracted short form world, blogs continue to outperform." And I don't know, I'm a big fan of blogs. When I'm trying to figure something out at 2 in the morning, uh, blog results, they tend to pop on the searches that I do and the research that I'm doing, and they can give me something that is, 5 pages, 6. I'm using Pages. Who uses Pages anymore? But they can give me something that's sufficiently detailed and deep to help me understand something, but doesn't require me to go read a whole book in the moment, which is not something I can generally accomplish at 2 in the morning. Um,
Yeah, I
so
think that's a very good point. There's obviously places for reading books, but if you're working on something and you're stuck on something, then you're probably not going to read a book to get yourself unstuck. But a blog, you might read that.
yeah, and apparently that quote, "In this highly distracted short form world, blogs continue to outperform," that came from Aaron Wisling, and he was paraphrasing something similar that Simon Willison had said. So I got to get my attribution set up properly. Well, speaking of blogs, obviously we mentioned 2 that you've written about Postgres in the last 2 years, both of which were very popular. If I remember correctly, I think they both hit front page Hacker News. So not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, am really curious, like whether you have a blog in your head about some of the new stuff that's in Postgres 17 and whether that blog will transfer from your head onto paper or onto a blog. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think so. Like that latest blog that I did, it was around changes to the Postgres 16 query planner.
Uh-huh.
I think I've got to write a sequel to that for Postgres 17. It's something that's evolving, still evolving, and I think the amount of people that are now working on the planner has increased. There's quite a lot of changes gone in recently, and I think, providing a bit more detail about what's changed and a few examples. For somebody to read the release notes, there's a lot of information that has to go in the release notes. Like you can't provide all the detail that people really want in that. You have to keep them realistically readable. So like going into a few of those, like in terms of query planner changes, I think that can be quite useful if you turn that into a few examples. Like that blog did that. It showed an example of how the Postgres 15 query planner would optimize something, and then it went on to show what had changed in Postgres 16. And I think if you're a user and you're thinking of upgrading, it's good to show SQL and query plans, things that they're used to looking at. So that would be one thing. And
Definitely
I
some people who reached out to me who really liked the structure of that Postgres 16 optimizer blog that you wrote. They loved seeing the PG15 explain output and the PG16 explain output, as well as the query itself right above that. And so you were, the phrase I often use is I like to show, not tell. And I think there's a big difference between someone just telling someone how something is going to work versus showing it to them. And your code examples and output examples really showed people. So, yeah, I think it'd be
thank you.
great if you copy that technique again.
Does that, I'm gonna have to do that every year now. That's
Well, I don't know about every year, but at least do it for Postgres 17, one step at a time. I used to be a runner, and my dad would run with me on weekends, and sometimes I would just be tired. You've run 8 miles and you're getting exhausted, and you just want to take a break. And he was always pushing me, like, okay, no, just go to that tree about a quarter mile ahead. And then we get there, and I'm like, okay, I need to take a break, Dad. He's like, no, no, look, let's just go to the corner. And then we get to the corner, and he's like, okay, just go to the next building. And so, yeah, all I'm going to ask you for right now is the Postgres 17 blog post, and then we can have a conversation about what the tree is after that.
okay, right. Now I see how your mind works. Okay.
All right. Did we didn't really explore whether there's a connection between the performance buzz that you get like when you make something faster. And you suggested that maybe there's a connection to your motorbike days, right? And how you used to enjoy, working on the bike. But I'm curious, like for the other time that you spend outdoors, because I know sometimes I can't, if I wanted to, I couldn't reach you on the weekend because you're going to be in the mountains, backpacking, whitewater rafting, hiking, doing whatever you're doing. There's probably no cell signal, right? You really enjoy the outdoors. Um, is that time away from the computer an important component of your ability to then come back and sit at your desk and like architect solutions in this complex system? Or is it completely unrelated?
I think it helps. Like I've been in some remote mountain hut somewhere, and I've been thinking about some problem maybe while I'm walking. And there's definitely been ideas generated. And there's times where I might go away for the weekend, and yeah, there's no cell signal. I mean, it's improving, but primarily there's none. And like I've definitely come back with ideas, and I might come back on Sunday evening, and I'm like, I need to check something. Like I need to see if something in the Postgres code is the way I think it is in my head when I'm away. And there's certainly like a lot of things that have turned into actual patches that are now in Postgres as a result of things I've thought about when I'm in the mountains somewhere. Don't ask me what specifically, but this definitely has happened.
You know, for a talk that I'm going to give at PGConf later this year in Athens, it's an analysis of all the contributions to Postgres in the Postgres 17 timeframe, and it's both code and also non-code. And I'm collaborating on the research with Daniel Gustafson, who you know, obviously, another Postgres committer and contributor. Anyway, what's my point? I know I have one. Um, as we look at the commit messages that people submit, I don't know, maybe there should be a new piece of metadata that gets added, which is like source. Like, where did this idea come from? And in your case, it would be like the Southern Alps or something like that. And then we could you could capture this data and we can look back on it in 5 years and see how many of your patches had their source when you were in the outdoors, and then we'll know.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Maybe not worth putting in commit messages, but maybe to track that personally, maybe. So maybe for my own optimizations or something. And I could maybe use it to, um, convince my manager to give me that leave.
Is KK listening right now? I don't know. Is he on the chat? I'll have to go look. Um, I'm curious though, like when I have an idea, I'm genuinely concerned that I will lose the idea before I can write it down. Like, I feel like really creative ideas can just slip right through your fingers. And so I try to make sure that I always have like I have a mini notebook in my purse just in case my phone is dead and I can't write it down in the notes app on my phone. Um, and even on my desk, like maybe my phone's in the other room, maybe the computer's crashing. There's post-it notes where I could scribble if I absolutely had to. Um, so I'm a big believer in don't assume you're going to remember it later because you won't. But it sounds like you think of these things while you're off for the weekend and you remember them completely. Like they don't ever slip out of your recollection?
I I sometimes do write them down. Sometimes I don't feel like I have to. I've certainly there's been times where there's some ideas maybe flashed into my head, and I might spend the entire remainder of the trip walking along thinking about that idea. And it's pretty hard to forget when you spend your entire day thinking about it. But there's also the ones that maybe you think about more briefly, and I will maybe type those into my phone somewhere, and just to make sure that the idea doesn't disappear.
Disappear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just disapparate into thin air. And then you're like, oh, I knew, I had it, I had it. Um, my ideas can be kind of wacky too. If it's not about solving a particular problem, which therefore if the problem is in front of you, then maybe the solutions will get remembered. But they might be something just unexpected. Anyway, and so therefore if I don't write them down, they're gone. All
I
right.
think if nobody ever had a wacky idea, the world would be a pretty different place today.
And it would be boring, wouldn't it?
Potentially. I, I think we'd probably have a lot less technology if nobody had a crazy idea ever.
Question for you. I was listening to a Postgres FM podcast episode the other day while I was out for a walk, and that's the podcast that is hosted by Michael Christophides and Nikolai. Oh, I have trouble pronouncing Nikolai's last name, so I'm not even going to try. Um, it's an awesome podcast, much shorter episodes, more focused on the features of Postgres. But anyway, in there, Michael ended up talking about the priority or the trade-off between performance and reliability and correctness. So how do you think about the priority of performance work versus the priority of reliability and correctness?
Obviously, like correctness has to come first. You can optimize something as much as you want if you don't have to provide the correct answer. Like you can make it infinitely fast. So in terms of priority, obviously, like correct results. If you're talking about like the results of a query, then we can't start returning incorrect results in to favor performance. Um, so that's definitely priority one. Not crashing is very important, and you have to fit performance around those two things. It's performance is quite hard as well, I think, because Postgres is such a flexible piece of software, and when we write it, there's so many different use cases for using Postgres. It's quite hard to find typical use cases, and you tend to like if you want to work on a performance patch, you might find the best case for this performance work, but you don't necessarily know the best case is a common case. And I think that's why keeping your finger on the pulse from, like the Postgres general mailing list to find out what problems people are actually experiencing, and make sure you try and fix those problems and don't fix problems that are just made up in your head or, you know.
In your ivory tower, in your
Yeah.
Southern Alps.
Yeah, I don't pretend to always fix, problems people are actually having, but the more you can sort of keep check on that general mailing list and, listening to what users have to say, the more chance you've got of actually fixing problems that are actually real problems.
Um, One of the things we talked about when we were getting ready for this episode is we talked about what I call the toothbrush test. And anybody who's a regular listener to this podcast has heard of the toothbrush test, which I first learned about when I was 21 years old. And it's this notion of when you're brushing your teeth in the morning, which you should be doing. Not everybody does, but whatever. I do. Like, are you looking forward to your work? Right? Is your avocation and vocation connected? Are you um, looking forward to going and doing whatever it is that you do? In your case, for Postgres at Microsoft. So, does your work pass the toothbrush test?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like living in this New Zealand time zone, quite often most of the discussions that happen on the Postgres mailing lists or when I'm sleeping, maybe not most of them, but a lot of them. So quite often when I wake up in the morning, like I maybe don't know exactly what I'm going to be working on that particular day. But when I check my email, if I've had a response to something, then that can quite often I quite often decide from there, and quite often that is actually me reading emails when I'm still contemplating getting out of bed in the morning, and quite often the plan gets formed before I get out of bed. So I'm pre-toothbrush.
Got it. Pre toothbrush, but looking forward to it. And I'm dropping a bunch of the mailing lists links into the show notes just to make sure that they end up there because it sounds like they were important to forming the kind of Postgres developer you become, but it also sounds like they're part of your day to day.
I think the emails I'm talking about are primarily maybe people's responses to things that I'd written, and that might be working on a particular patch, and that might be somebody's reviewed something I've worked on, or I've reviewed something they've worked on and they've responded. And then that might involve me doing more work on my patch or me doing more review on their patch.
Um, I'm curious what software you use for email list management. There's a lot of email.
Yeah, there is a huge amount of email traffic. Yeah, I don't. have anything too special. I use Gmail, and I just use the web interface for Gmail. Actually, mostly like it. I can't fault it enough to want to change away from it, and I'm used to it, which is the important part for me.
My experience with Gmail is that search on the desktop is dramatically better and more correct than search on my phone. Is that a Claire problem, or is that your experience as well?
I have not noticed it being better or worse on any of the two.
Okay.
Like, I sort of mix between searching on the Postgres mailing archives and on my email. It is sometimes slightly frustrating on the Postgres emailing search because they time out. Um, I think as a committer, you do sort of quite a lot of archaeology to find out why certain decisions were made, and it might predate me working on Postgres, so I might not have some old emails. So I might consult the archives from, you know,
For
15
that.
years ago or something like that. And that that's useful.
All right, so if you could time travel and give advice to your younger self about getting started as a developer, or getting started with Postgres, um, what advice would you give yourself? Is there anything you wish you'd known then?
I mean, that is a good question. Um, I think it often makes sense to sort of try and utilize your strengths in what you do, and you shouldn't not learn new things as a result of doing that. But I think if you can utilize your strengths, then you stand out. And I think, like, if it comes to somebody that wants to maybe get involved in working on Postgres, I think that uh, because there's quite a lot of people doing that at the moment, I think we probably have some bandwidth issues when it comes to getting people's stuff committed into Postgres. There's, I think, because we're growing quite quickly, there's just a sort of more newer people, and the ratio of new people to experienced people is just probably not exactly what it would be ideally. So I think one thing that somebody new that wants to submit something, a patch to the Postgres mailing list or something, is try and make your work stand out. Try and prove that you've done the research and you've looked at the archives and you've done all your homework, and try and not make it look like you've woke up this morning and came up with this idea and written a patch. I think when people come and they've done all their homework and due diligence, I think it's just easier. The bars, you have to do less as a committer to to get those things into shape, and I think that might help people have a better experience in the community.
Um, that's like magic to my ears to hear you talk about, just because I don't know. Years ago, I worked with someone, and gosh, this would have been late 2000s, mid 2000s, I don't know. And his goal was to get stuff off his plate. And it was like oil and water for me, because I felt like, well, wait a minute. It's you're working with other people. When it goes off your plate, it's going onto these 50 other people's plates. And don't you want to make it more efficient for them? Like, if what you communicate is ambiguous or unclear, that means 50 people get stuck, right? Trying to figure out what does this mean? What am I supposed to do? How do I act on it? So anyway, that I like, of course, what you said about trying to make your work stand out, but I guess I was also hearing this fact that you need your work to also be clear. Maybe I was hearing what I wanted to hear from what you were saying. Was there Did Melanie Plageman give a talk last year at PGConf EU about let me go look it up. I think it was like techniques or suggestions or tips for making your Postgres patches more likely to get committed or accepted or something like that. Does that ring a bell to you, David?
Yeah, I know that Samai Sharma also talked about something along those lines.
I found
I
it.
don't know if he did a talk or if he certainly gave a lot of feedback around, people new to the experience of somebody that's new to the Postgres community.
Okay, I found Melanie's talk. It's called Making Your Patch More Committable. And the idea is that if you've ever written a patch that stalled out on the mailing list, then this talk is for you. And so she walked through specific ideas and tips and things people can do to make their patch just more actionable, more likely to get committed. Okay.
And I think the people should probably watch that if it's available because and Melanie has had quite a lot of success, and what she has been doing has worked for her, and she's now a Postgres committer.
Yeah, as of I think it was April of this year, 2024, Melanie Plageman and Richard Guo were both announced as the newest Postgres committers, which is very exciting. And in
It is
fact,
indeed.
yeah, Melanie is going to be a guest on this episode next month, which we'll dive into in a second. Okay, so is there anything I didn't ask you that you really want to talk about your journey as a developer or into Postgres?
Um, I don't think so. I I'll probably think of something later and kick myself, but
Well, I think we're gonna wrap because we're almost at an hour and a half, and it's not set in stone. We don't have to wrap. There is a question I didn't ask you, which maybe you're saved by the bell, unless you actually do have a story you want to tell. But there's this idea. I first got exposed to it at FOSDEM last year, at the PG Day that was at FOSDEM, where I think one of the engineers gave a talk that was an LFMF talk, learn from my failure. And I just thought it was so powerful because like everybody was paying attention. Everybody could feel for him as he told his story, right? Because it was a painful failure. And but we all did learn from it. I think people don't talk about failure enough, right? We try to stay away from it. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, we don't feel good about it. And yet it can help others when we do share it. So anyway, I'm curious. I think I had told you I might ask this question. Did you come up with a story you wanted to share? And if not, you're saved by the bell.
so when you started talking about that, it made me think of so at PGCon in 2019, the last one before COVID times. I remember it was Melanie Plageman that did a talk on failed patches for the query planner in Postgres. And she had some statistics to share, and her point was that mostly like query planner stuff's hard, and the failure rate for submitting patches and having them rejected is quite high. And I think Melanie did a good job of summing up all my failures on that talk, because I think there's not a huge number of people submitting patches for the query planners. So like a good proportion of the ones that she was talking about, I think were my patches.
And so we should all go look at her slides and then we'll get some visibility into some of your failures. But were those really failures? Like, isn't it the case that you have to put forward proposed patches and you can't possibly expect them all to be accepted? Like, if you wait for the perfect patch requests, wouldn't we all still be waiting and nothing would be getting improved?
I mean, yeah, I guess it's hard to give any specific advice about that, because like if you talk to some entrepreneur, they'll probably tell you that, you just have to keep trying things until you succeed. Um, and I earlier said that maybe that wasn't always the best thing to do for the Postgres community. I think, that's primarily due to the volume of things that get submitted to the community. Um,
Okay,
sorry,
well, now I need to go find this PGCon 2019 talk about failed patches for the query planner because I'm curious now.
yeah, I've definitely had a lot of failures. Like, um,
And a lot of impact, a lot of positive impact.
I think primarily failures are. I think I could probably attribute most of them just to being maybe slightly too excited about some change and thinking it's going to be great, but I've sort of let that excitement sort of curb the research that I should have done into if this is a good idea or not. And I imagine that happens for a lot of people. I think having something accepted into Postgres it's quite an exciting thing for somebody that's maybe never had that before, because it's a well-used piece of software, and the thought of maybe having your name in the credits or something is, I think, is definitely appealing. And I've definitely been victim to that, probably, in my early days of working in Postgres, just letting the excitement get in the way of doing the proper homework.
All right, well, David Rowley, I have enjoyed this conversation, as with all our conversations. But I've enjoyed you being willing to have this discussion in public with a live audience here on Discord. And this episode will get published in a couple days. So the rest of the world will get to listen to it by Friday of this week. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me and giving me the chance to tell my story.
I love it, and I know other people are going to enjoy listening to this. I also want to let our listeners know that the next episode, episode 19, can you believe 19 episodes of this monthly podcast? It's going to be recorded live back in our normal Wednesday at 10 a.m. PDT time slot, but it's going to be in the third week of September, so Wednesday, September 18th. And our guest is going to be Melanie Plakeman, who we just finished talking about. And the topic is becoming a Postgres committer. So please mark your calendar with aka.ms/talking Postgres, all one word, -EP19-cal, CAL. And that'll give you a calendar invite that has instructions on how to join, etc. And then in October, episode 20 is going to be with Tom Lane. Tom is also a Postgres committer and contributor. And that live recording will be on Wednesday, October 9th at 10 a.m. And Tom is going to talk to us about how he got started as a developer and in Postgres. So you can also mark your calendar for that October episode with that same syntax, aka.ms/talking Postgres -EP20-cal. You can also get to all past episodes of the podcast, and as well as links to subscribe on whichever your favorite podcast platform is at talkingpostgres.com. And before we leave, if you have enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends in person, on social media, in DMs, however you share recommendations to your friends and your followers. The hashtag is Talking Postgres, all one word. And word of mouth is absolutely one of the best ways to help people discover a podcast that will hopefully delight them. A big thank you to everybody who joined on Discord too and participated in the live text chat.